asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
Huge excitement about our first guest coming on the programme. I'm delighted that he's agreed to come back. He was on with me about this time last year, I think. I came across him back in 2008. Nobody made more sense to me when explaining the so-called financial crisis at that time, and I've been following him ever since. He's an economist, author, and he heads up the School of Economics, History and Politics at Kingston University in London. Delighted to welcome back Professor Steve Keen. Steve, welcome back. How are you?
Very good, Richie. Very good.
Thanks for doing it. Are you in Amsterdam as we speak? Because you mentioned Amsterdam.
Yes, a long story, but I'm sort of living in both countries at the moment, and a whole lot of reasons why. I'll talk about them offline if necessary.
Yeah, lovely. Sounds good. Visited the city once. That was last year, and really enjoyed my time there. Now, our time, of course, is finite, so I won't waste it. When I announced you were coming on today, a lot of interest. Unsurprising that my listeners would be, of course, interested in you, of course, along with others. I said, what would you like me to put to Professor Steve Keen? Question number one, unsurprisingly, will the UK ever properly leave the European Union?
Oh, God. I mean, I'm somebody who voted for Brexit, not because I thought it'd be good for the European Union, but I thought I'd rather get out of a club I didn't want to be part of in the first place. And it'd be sensible to start making preparations for it to collapse, because I thought at some stage in the future it's inevitable that the euro will break up, and that will have to have cascading effects, of course, on the whole European Union program. But the capacity for the British ruling class to manage things in an incompetent fashion has convinced me that the very first show I saw when I came to the UK was actually a documentary. It was Monty Python's final show. And I mean, Theresa Cameron calling a referendum he intended to lose, to have lose, which won, which means he lost office, which May comes in. Corbyn comes in because of the Labor Party foolishly thinking that making the election democratic would ensure one of the Blairite candidates rather than a rebel. And then the incompetence with which Brexit itself has been handled. Honestly, I mean, in some ways, one of the reasons I was delighted to consider living in Amsterdam rather than London, and I'm sick of getting Brexit on every conversation like he got spam in that famous Monty Python skit.
Now, you said the negotiations have been mishandled by the government. Let me put this to you by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, writing in The Telegraph. Now, just for the sake of it, I'll remind our listeners, obviously Pritchard, Telegraph writer, is very much pro leaving, and he's very much he's been an anti-European Union writer for a long time. But on the idea that the government is messing up things, he writes, about 3 weeks ago, he writes, the harsh truth is the government has drifted into a Greek Syriza trap, allowing itself to be beaten down by protracted talks on terms set entirely by Brussels. Such an imbalanced structure leaves Britain vulnerable to what traders call time decay, with a cliff edge drawing nearer. He basically says that the UK should have opted for WTO terms from the outset, reversing the roles. Then Brussels would have had to come running, begging for an open trade deal. Is he right to say that these roadblocks and stumbling blocks are all coming from the side of Brussels?
Oh, yes, he's right that it was a deliberate policy by the Europeans to derail what was the vote, the Brexit vote. And this is exactly how they treated the vote for Syriza in Greece, and it's how they're treating, of course, they tried to treat the vote for the rebels in Italy, now the government in Italy. So they're not negotiating in good faith. And the very first mistake the British made was to agree to divorce settlement terms that affect the penalty to be paid before they agreed to the separation terms. It is like agreeing, this is what I'm going to pay my spouse on the divorce, before you decide who gets the house and who gets the kids. It was just naive negotiation. That was my first sign they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And you also have to realise that the Maastricht Treaty, which formed the euro rather than the entire European Union, but that was written in such a way that there was no possibility of getting out. It was like an Irish wedding contract of 20 or 30 years ago. So there's no mechanism to begin with to get out of this arrangement. and the bureaucrats in Brussels were trying to make it as hard as possible anyway. But they virtually needn't have tried to because, again, the entire negotiation process has been so incompetent. Yeah,
it's been dreadful. We before we talk about Italy, because we've just briefly talked about Greece, I want to ask you another question about the UK. But on Greece, a lot of we've listeners right across Europe, and we hear from Greek people. I don't get very much right. I'm certainly not an economist. I wouldn't dare claim that I am. I'm a guy who reads a lot of financial publications, and I've read a lot of your work over the years. And as I said, it makes a lot of sense to me. I was kind of certain, and I did say it, and it's on record, it's the only thing I've ever gotten right, that Tsipras and the Greeks would capitulate in the end. I mean, they put the terms of the Troika bailout to the Greek people. They told the Greek people to reject it. They did, and then they capitulated. Why, Steve? Why did they capitulate?
I think I really highly recommend, for anybody who wants to understand what the hell's going to go happen in Europe now with Italy, what's happening for the next 10 years, and what the previous 20 years have been like, read Yanis Varoufakis' Adults in the Room. It's a wonderful expose of what it was like to be finance minister for Greece and the way he was treated by all the various negotiators for the European Union. And it includes transcript of recordings he basically illegally recorded, put them entirely verbatim in the book, and he's basically saying, so sue me, and nobody's dared sue him so far, so you can trust all the conversation there as being gospel truth as to what actually happened. And they really just tortured the Greek negotiators right from the outset, telling them, quote unquote, by Schäuble, again in the book, that political elections should not be able to interfere with economic policy. Notice they interfere. In other words, economic has primacy over politics. And that, again, is the nature of the way the European Union was formed, because many people would say that the rise of the Nazis, the Great Depression, the Second World War were due to bad political choices. That's the way economists actually interpreted it. And in many ways, they'd like to have politics taken out of economics and given over to the hands of the experts, which, of course, are the neoclassical economists. And look what a fine job they've done. Now, of course, having designed something like the euro, which was on a hiding to nothing to fail, they're just not about to admit that it's going to fail, so they basically torture anybody who wants to leave. And finally, that particular referendum, I had heard scuttlebutt that when Tsipras called it, he was, again, like Cameron, hoping it would lose. That's verified again in Yanis's book, because Yanis was euphoric that the populace had voted 60% to reject the European Union's terms. He ran into Tsipras's office, jubilant, and found himself in a room of depressed people. So they were, and then of course what Tsipras did was just basically he'd hoped to hand it over to the Greek people, have the Greek people tell him, yes, accept the terms. He'd go along and reluctantly have to accept the terms. Instead, he did the Stockholm Syndrome thing of ignoring what his own people said and falling over to what Merkel and Schäuble were putting him through. And you've seen the state of Greece as a result of that for the last 3 years.
So it should have defaulted, it should have left, and it should have introduced the drachma, even though it wouldn't have been worth anything. But it should have started again.
It was quite a drachma. What was actually proposed, and again, this is well worth reading Yanis's book to see what's going on. There's a set of IMF bonds, which themselves were not particularly important, but part of the IMF's charter is such that it's not allowed to give loans when it has no expectation of them given back. It got strong-armed in being part of the Troika by the European Union. So what Yanis had as a trigger was, first of all, to say we're going to default on the IMF bonds, which would then cause a cascade effect of causing the European Central Bank bonds to fail, which would have brought QE to its knees. So it was one hell of a weapon. And then at the same time to bring in a tax credit system, rather like the mini-bots, which is being spoken about by the Italians as a potential parallel payment system, not actually a currency, but a payment system. That was all ready to go. Now, Yanis has a very strong belief in democracy. You can see that by how he's formed DiEM25. He had the capacity, he had the right delegated to him by Tsipras to say, we're going to pull the trigger in one of the meetings of the finance ministers. And in a chapter titled in the book, Mea Maxima Culpa, for those who know their Latin, for those who don't, my most grievous fault, he decided not to pull the trigger, but to go and see Tsipras and get Tsipras to pull the trigger, and Tsipras declined.
That's very interesting. That we'll leave Greece for now, because I've been very critical of, not personally, of course, you wouldn't expect that, but I've been very critical of the actions of Yanis Varoufakis during that period. And you've presented a fairly balanced argument against my thoughts that basically he ran away from the Greeks at their, at their worst possible time, rather than face down these.
Read the book, mate. Read the book.
Yeah, I'll have a look at it. Yeah,
I've known you for 25 years. You've been a friend for that length of time. And one thing I was reading the book, one thing I was looking for was to see whether he would say I made a mistake at any point and what that mistake was. That was the one I was expecting to see. That's what he said. He regrets the decision. But of course, given his combination of things, strong belief in democracy and always a willingness to try to work things through, that made him make that decision not to pull the trigger. As I said in my review, I would like to think that I would pull the trigger myself had I been in the same situation, but I wasn't there and he was. And it's a very, very different thing to be on the line in a situation like this, to being commenting from the outside, thinking, hypothesizing what you might do if you were in those circumstances.
Fair enough, Steve. Professor Steve Keane is our guest. Check out Debunking Economics if you haven't read it before. It's fascinating, a really insightful read, and it's very reader friendly. I have to say that it really is. For people sometimes get a bit. I used to shake my head when the subject of economics came up, but do check it out, and Steve's other books as well. Live on the line to us from Amsterdam. Absolute craziness, chaos going on in Italy at the moment. Liga and Five Star have, it seems, formed a government. Well, it's imminent anyway. How long that government lasts is another thing. Interestingly enough, it's been reported that people like Luigi Di Maio is a moderate, despite some of the things he said about the single currency and about the European Union, that he might be a moderate, that, these guys might have very, very drastic plans for the country. How radical are these guys really, do you think, Steve, in Italy? And what's to say that they won't abandon the promises they made in their manifesto when they come under the sorts of pressure we've just been talking about?
Well, in fact, I'm quite impressed with how they handled themselves so far, because the sticking point was Savona, I think Savona or Savoni, the 81-year-old professor of economics who was actually the person who developed Italy's first econometric model of its own economy, who'd worked for the Treasury, worked for the central bank, was chief of a small business lobby in the country, ran a bank. He was blocked by the Prime Minister. Why? Because he said we need contingency plans in case the euro fails. And he worked out the idea of the mini-bot. Now, if it had been the Cyprus style negotiating, where the relevant authorities said, no, you can't have that person, there may have been a decision, oh, okay, who else do you want? Well, what they actually said was, no, we resign, we're not going to form a government. And that then put the other side on the back foot. And finally, they've come back. Savona is now in the ministry. He's not as finance minister. I think he's an economic minister or some other position, but it means he will have a say in how the Italians react to any negotiations they have to do through the finance ministry, cabal, which by far is the most dominant political grouping in the European Union. So I think they're handling themselves fairly well so far. But of course, there's an enormous difference on social policy between the two wings. And there's a strong, as Jan has pointed out in one of his most recent blogs, a strong racist element too to the position of the Northern League about the immigration. Because again, we all know Italy is copying the largest number, by the looks of it, of migrants coming across from Africa.
So is it a bit unfair then to say racist, Steve? I mean, I get this all. I've used the term racist before. I'm categorised as some sort of socialist, but I don't identify as anything. I just have opinions. Is it a bit unfair because that immigration has caused massive problems in terms of its effect on public services? And is it easy, and I don't mean for you, but for everybody, is it easy to just label people as racist when they talk about the effect that immigration has on public services?
Yeah, that's one potential interpretation. I definitely don't know the parties involved. I could actually meet up and say, yeah, they're racist. From my own personal dealings, if I ever did meet them, I could come away and say, no, they're people who are fighting the pressure of, massive extra numbers. We really don't know. But certainly we're going to face enormous migration of people being forced by military conflicts in the Arabian area and by climate failure in north of Africa in the next 20 or 30 years. And of course, that puts enormous pressure on social cohesion, on social services, and so on. So it's not amazing you get a knee-jerk reaction to it.
Funnily enough, you described there a second ago kind of an attempted coup by the EU on Italy by refusing Paolo Savona, or at least telling the president that Paolo Savona was unacceptable. The finance minister will be Professor Giovanni Tria. I don't know how much you know. You might know him, in fact, but he must be a reader of your work, Steve, because he's basically said, at any opportunity over the years, looking into his background in the last few days, that Germany has basically used the single currency to lock in for them an advantage over everybody else in Europe, running a current account surplus of 8.5% of GDP at the expense of everybody else in Europe, which basically screws, not to put too fine a point on it, everybody in the south. That's something you've been talking about for a long, long time. How does that work in layman's terms? Can you explain that in a way that our listeners will understand it?
Simple say, imagine we've got two countries that agree to share a currency where one has a slightly higher inflation rate than the other. What that means is over time, one country's goods are getting cheaper compared to the other country. But that's what's been happening with Greece versus Italy. And the difference is trivial. I actually got quite a surprise when I saw the data just recently. The average annual rate of inflation in Italy since the euro was formed is just below 2%, about 1.9% per annum. That's a very low rate of inflation, the sort of thing you'd think, that's actually below the target that central banks hit. Well, Germany's hit 1.4%, which is lower still. In fact, that's at a level now where central banks are trying to increase inflation above that level. When you compound that virtually 0.5% per annum difference in prices over the 20 years or so that the euro has been in existence, what that means is that German prices are 10% lower than Italian prices. Now, consequently, a Mercedes-Benz with comparable price to a Lamborghini when the euro was formed is now 10% cheaper than the Lamborghini. And that keeps on happening. German goods are cheaper than Italian goods. Italians will tend to buy more German goods than Italian goods. You start getting a trade deficit coming out of that, favouring deficit out of Italy, surplus for Germany. And that in turn means that German firms are financing their investment courtesy of their trade surplus, which means they can actually continue getting ahead of Lamborghini, which doesn't get the same investment funds. So it's a problem which compounds on itself. The simple way out of it is to devalue your currency by 10%. You can't because you both use the euro.
Because you're in the euro. That was obviously a deliberate thing. I mean, I get a lot of...
No, I wouldn't say it's conspiratorial, but what I'd say is you never sign a pact with somebody about, let's go jumping in the ocean if the person you're going to jump in the ocean actually enjoys cold water. Now, that is the case with Germany. Germany is terrified of inflation after the Weimar Republic experience. Even though they agreed, the agreed target for the Eurozone was a 2% per annum rate of inflation, Germany, even though it was well below that 2%, continued putting pressure on its trade unions not to negotiate for wage rises. So there's been a lower rate of inflation in Germany because wage rises haven't been sufficient to keep up with the cost of living there. The German workers have been losing out. So that's the Germans wanting more pain on a low rate of inflation and willing to inflict it on their working class. And the impact of that has destabilised the Eurozone. If they'd agreed to and stuck to the 2% target, and Italy by far came closest to that target, then there would not have been this drift, there would not have been the trade balance differences as well. So the Germans caused this. The mistake is holding hands with somebody who enjoys cold water.
And for everybody in Europe, that means essentially that love him or loathe him, and I think it might be the latter for you, when people like Nigel Farage use terms like fascist dictatorship, he's right. It is a fascist dictatorship.
Well, it's a dictatorship in the sense that it's been a set of rules that are set up that mean you can't change the rules. And whether the rules make sense or not, you've got to execute the rules. Now, what was the excuse of the Nuremberg trials? I was simply following orders.
Yeah.
Well, it's not quite the same thing, obviously, but nonetheless, if you have a set of rigid rules which do not work, which numerous critics have said before it happened and have said after it's not going to work, it's going to break down, you continue making those rules apply, you are causing social breakdown, supposedly in the name of economic progress.
Steve Keane is our guest. We've got Steve for another 5 or 6 minutes. It's coming up for 16 minutes to the top of the air. It's your Richie Allen Show live on Fab Radio 2. Tune in, of course, as well. Trigger warning and richieallen.co.uk. Now, the Labour movement under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, I know you support some of their ideas. I certainly support the renationalisation of vital public services. I do. That's why I get called a socialist, of course, but I really do believe in that. It's where I come from. I come from a trade union background. But those ideas seem to be contradictory. They're not compatible with Corbyn and McDonnell wanting to stay in some sort of customs union. There's a lot of contradictory policies coming out of the Labour Party. What do you think about some of these policies?
Oh, I think, well, things like renationalisation of the railways and things like that.
Yeah.
There should be no difficulty in doing it because, of course, the ironic thing is that most of those privatised railways, excepting Virgin, of course, are owned by European rail companies which are government-owned. So there's no problem saying we're going to go back to government ownership here. We'll just hand back the shares to the European nationally owned railway systems that own and are not investing in British rail. So I think there's a fair bit of room to do what they want to do. And again, it's interesting to the extent to which the European Union does not enforce its rules unless the finance minister's cabal decide it's a good idea to do it. Because, for example, Italy's government debt-to-GDP ratio, which I don't think should matter, because the Euro's made these things important, that began at almost twice the maximum level allowed under the rules of the Maastricht Treaty. And it hasn't been mentioned at all until suddenly they have a left-wing government again. Now they're talking about their debt being too high, private government debt being too high. So the European Union very selectively enforces its own rules.
Couple of quick questions, Steve. What about the idea for a national investment bank? There hasn't been so much talk of that from the Labour Party of late. But this is one of the big things they talked about before the last election. I would have thought any national investment bank is going to have to be capitalised by the Central Bank of England, which is capitalised by the European Central Bank. So you're still looking at...
No, it's not. No, it's not. That's one of the few things you can say in favour of British politics is deciding not to join the euro. So the Bank of England can do whatever it wants because it's the only monopoly producer of British pounds. So there's no problem about the British Central Bank, capitalising a national investment corporation in Britain.
Okay, but they would still be borrowing from that Central Bank of England.
One of the mistakes we make is thinking people borrow from overseas because they need to borrow overseas to produce local currency. You don't borrow overseas because you need to produce local currency using it. You borrow overseas because you're running a trade deficit, and your customers need to have American dollars or European euros to buy goods, and you're selling it to them. So the borrowing. You don't need to borrow anything from anywhere to create British pounds.
Help me out here then, because the country is running a massive deficit, a borrowing deficit. It borrows. Governments must borrow from the Central Bank of England to pay for its basically to pay for running the government. Right? It does borrow from the Central Bank of England. That's how it works.
Indirectly, but if you had a Bank of Richie and you could borrow from the Bank of Richie and anybody accepts the bills issued by the Bank of Richie in full payment of any contract you had with the company Richie, would you be worried?
Yes, but it doesn't work like that in reality, because in reality...
It does work like that in reality with a central bank.
But not in this country it doesn't. Because...
Well, put it this way. You have your central bank has financed £200 billion worth of quantitative easing purchases of bonds off the finance sector for the last decade. Where in your tax return have you seen you're paying for QE? The answer is you haven't. The Bank of England simply credits the accounts for the financial institutions with the bonds they're wanting to buy for $200 billion and puts that as an asset on its asset side of its books. It's now got £200 billion worth of bonds. It's simply accounting. And in a very roundabout way, the same thing applies to the borrowing by the Treasury. If that is financed by the central bank, it's all accounting operations inside the central bank.
Explain to me and to our listeners then, obviously the Labour Party is hugely popular. Jeremy Corbyn is a big movement of younger people because austerity measures enforced by the last coalition government and this government have obviously hit services right across the board here to pay down the deficit. To who? Who's the money owed to?
Oh, well, this is the thing. You don't actually have to. What the money is a record of government money creation over the previous couple of centuries. Because when you have the government creating money, if you could possibly directly borrow from the central bank, and it's not possible to do that because of laws which have been put in place to stop it, but technically it's possible to do that. What happens is the Treasury works out what it thinks its tax revenue is going to be for the next year, works out what its spending is likely to be, issues bills for the difference. In a very roundabout way, they could probably sell those bills to the Bank of England. The Bank of England says, okay, we'll buy those bonds off you, or put a creditor for that exactly same amount in your Treasury account, you can now spend. So in that sense, the change in government debt is a record of government money creation. The indirect way that it goes about means that actually it takes money which gets stuck in the financial sector and siphons it back into the real economy when they sell the bonds not to the central bank but to private financial institutions. But fundamentally, if you go the whole hog of the central bank buying 100% of those bonds that are issued by the Treasury, sold to the financial sector, the central bank bought all those bonds off the financial sector, that would be creating money, and the record of the change in government debt, which would all be debt the Treasury would then owe to the central bank, which of course is like Richie owing to Richie, that is simply a record of the amount of money that's been created that particular year.
So why the austerity why screw people to the wall to pay back a debt that doesn't need to be paid back then?
For the same reason people used to worry about epicycles and things like that. It's an understanding how the world operates, which is neat, plausible and fundamentally wrong. There's no necessity for the government to even issue a bonds to finance its own operations, so long as the money issued by its central bank is accepted as money in its realm. And of course, people do and have to accept the pound when it's tended to buy anything anywhere in the UK. So what people have done is they've used an analogy about what it would be like if a household was spending more than it got back and apply that to an entire country. Now, that is completely the wrong frame of reference. It's like trying to understand the solar system by assuming Earth is the centre and the sun and the moon and stars revolve around us. It's going to be a neat, plausible and totally wrong theory of how the universe operates. The same story about saying the government is like a household. If it's like a household, where's your central bank?
Yeah, let me go all
the wrong analogy.
Let me go all conspiratorial on you then, just for the last 90 seconds or so, right? Because I love this. So the result of this lunacy then that we're talking about is the sale of everything of any real value to massive corporations and to private interests. So you don't have to be Lieutenant Columbo to realise that this system is enforced by those who want to transfer real wealth, real assets into the hands of a tiny few.
That is one way to interpret it, and it's not.
Right.
Once I'm not going to jump on it as a conspiracy theory. It doesn't make sense, but the conspiracy
it's the
theory
truth,
does
right?
make sense.
Yeah.
But it's one of those. It's a plausible fallacy, which is useful for those who want to take over privately owned assets and make them privately owned. But it is still a fallacy, and ironically, it actually ends up debilitating the wealthy who do it as well. They might get the ownership of the assets, but the country itself grows more slowly. They'd be wealthier if they weren't so damn greedy.
I've been asked to ask you, this will be the final question, and well, it'll be the second last one because I want to hear about this documentary that you're involved in. I can't wait for that, by the way. Second last question then, where does the Bank for International Settlements come into that? If it's basically, because as I understand it, it's a bank for the central bank, so it capitalises or it funds to some degree central banks. What is it?
No, the BIS... I don't actually know the history of the BIS as well as I should, but I know it well enough to say that it fundamentally operates as a talking fest for the central banks of the world. There may have been a clearinghouse role at some stage, but it actually, well, even though it's called the Bank of International Settlements, it doesn't particularly do them. And in fact, the Bank of International Settlements research staff have been about the only ones worth reading from the whole official family, the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, Bill White, who was the research director when the financial crisis was underway and before it happened, was the only person in a formal position using Hyman Minsky's theories and warning about an approaching crisis. And he was doing it quite literally in the face of Alan Greenspan. So the BIS is actually one of the organisations I have a lot of time for.
Final question then. Good to have you back, by the way. You were fundraising on Thursday for a new documentary on inequality under capitalism. Tell us a bit about that and tell us where people can find out more about it.
I was just basically helping out because they got in touch with me and asked would I help promote it with my Twitter following and so on. And so I was happy to do it because I liked what they were trying to do. Unfortunately, they began with a conspiracy theory and a mathematically invalid theory of why our financial systems drive us into economic crises. The idea that if you borrow money, that because the government, the bank gives you the money, but not the money to pay the interest, the debt necessarily compounds. That's a mathematical fallacy. And one of the reasons I designed the Minsky software is to make it easy to establish that to people. So the documentary itself, they were in touch with me. I actually stood up and said, look, here's who I am. I'm the world expert on what you've just said at the beginning of this documentary, and you're wrong. And I'm hoping they'll get in touch with me and we can actually rewrite the documentary because the reason debt compounds has got far more to do with people's investment behaviour and decisions under uncertainty than it has with the simple idea that interest compounds and makes debt get bigger.
Do me a favour, come back in the autumn and talk to me in the autumn briefly about creating money out of thin air, not creating interest, because you said it's a fallacy. A lot of our listeners would be horrified to hear that because they're absolutely committed to that understanding that banks...
Money is created out of thin air in the sense that money doesn't come out of a bucket.
No.
Money is created by accounting, and it is in that sense thin air. And I'm quite happy to talk about the mechanics behind it and why in some circumstances, and almost all the time, in fact, you'll get a financial crisis out of it over the long term. Happy to do that. Great
for you to come back, Steve. I really appreciate it. Loved hearing from you again. Thanks for coming on the programme and continued success to you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome, Richie. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Professor Steve Keen, live on the line to us there from Amsterdam. Check out Debunking Economics if you haven't before. And you'll find Steve. He blogs a lot and he appears in a lot of newspapers as well, writing about these issues.